pursue that activism by other means. And I at least see his scholarship as a sort of a manifestation of that, as well as the research that he conveys to wider audiences beyond academia. And now when I think of a public intellectual, someone in the style, for me, the term always sort of evokes Edward Said, but it also evokes Khaled Fahmy, because that's the kind of scholar that he is. So he continues to inspire me. And he always shows us, that's another thing, that whatever period he happens to be working on, whether he's working on the 19th century, or as his talk today will discuss the middle of the 20th century, he is always interested in dismantling establishment and picking apart structures and discourses of power. So today he's going to be talking about the 1967 war, and I will let him tell you what he's going to be talking about. He's, according to his abstract, which I'm sure you've all seen, he asks three main questions in his talk. Did the defeat have to be so catastrophic? How come so few of the leading generals stood trial following the defeat? And how was it possible for the armed forces of Egypt to be rebuilt in time to begin the War of Attrition? So again, this is still a very controversial topic in Egypt. It's one that is not easy to investigate. The military archives are closed. And so just talking about the topic is already quite an impressive act of engaged scholarship, we'll say. So Khaled, I will now stop talking and mute myself. And thank you for being here and for letting me be the moderator.
No, thank you, Pascal, very much for this wonderful introduction. Thanks to George and Claudia and Jessica for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity. Thanks all for coming. I know some of you are fasting. We will try and finish before iftar. But thanks really, Pascal, for agreeing to moderate. And I know you yourself have been working on 67, so you dabbled in it the way I do. So I'm actually very much interested in hearing your remarks as well as everybody else's. This is a topic I've been working on and off for the past 3 years. And as George said, the minute an opportunity presents, it's, of course, my friends hate me now because this is the topic of conversation every time I see them, my friends and my family as well. But you're the new victims, but I hope it will be light and not very onerous. I have a PowerPoint presentation, so let me share it. Where is it? It's this one. I think I would like to start by a famous visit, famous in the historiography. It is the visit on the 1st of June, only 4 days before the war started, by the head of Mossad to Washington. He didn't meet the president, Johnson, but he met, and he didn't go to the CIA, but he met people in State Department and in the Pentagon. Most importantly, he met McNamara. 50 years later, there is a conference, a retrospective, 40 or 50 years later, in which Amit, here shown on the right, said the following. As you can see the quote, said McNamara asked only 2 questions: how long a war would last, to which Amit replied 7 days. And how many casualties Israel would sustain? Amit said, here I became a diplomat. I said less than in 1948 when we had 6,000. This is a famous, as I said, encounter, and it is recorded in a famous book by Richard Parker, a retrospective on 1967. And it is usually, this encounter is usually depicted or studied to answer an important question, which is how much of a collusion there was between the US and Israel? How much was there a common understanding? This is a question that Avi Schleim has asked in yet another book, another retrospective. This book we see here on the left. Avi Schleim is a professor of international relations emeritus at Oxford. And Schleim and many other people said that unlike the common view, there was no real green light that Washington gave to Israel. Rather, there was an amber light, a yellow light. You know, like, we really don't want to know that much. We do not give you a green light, but we're also not giving a red light. And that is the kind of scholarship about this encounter. For me, however, it isn't this. For me, the question is, what is it that Israel knew that made it so confident? The Israeli army, not the Israeli politicians, let alone the Israeli public. The Israeli public thought, because of the inflammatory rhetoric of Arab leaders, and most importantly, Nasser, that they are actually facing an existential crisis, that this is another Holocaust that they are entering. The Israeli military, however, as we've seen, thought that they could finish off the business with all the Arab armies combined in 7 days, and that they would not incur or suffer that many casualties. So the question is, what is it that they knew about the weakness of the Egyptian military and the Jordanian and the Syrian, but most importantly, the Egyptian military, that made them so convinced that they could finish off the business in 7 days? And the idea was, within these 7 days, please, Washington, do not press for a ceasefire. Let us finish off the business. That's the green light, or that's the amber light, whatever color you want to give it. For me, it isn't this. So let me share with you some kind of review of literature of what it is that we know, and how it is we know what we know about the Egyptian military. This is really what I want to concentrate on, the Egyptian front rather than the other fronts in 1967. Of course, we have ample evidence or ample documentation on the Israeli side from a very early time, from weeks after the war. This famous book came out, The Tanks of Tammuz, as the English translation is called. And it is really a celebration of the 3 main generals who, in the Sinai campaign, Yofi, Tal, and Sharon, and who became gods after the war. And this started a genre of writing about the Sinai campaign in particular that has become very, very dominant in our understanding of what took place in Sinai. Of course, as I said, there is now ample documentation. This more or less scholarly scholarship, Israeli scholarship, based on extensive documentation, mostly in the Israeli archives, but also in, especially Oren's book, extensive documentation in American, Soviet, French, and British archives, and interviews with some Arab politicians and indeed generals. Of course, there's a more popular account from Israel, which depicted, as I said earlier, that this was a real existential threat, but this doesn't need to detain us. This is a popular understanding within Israel of how they were surrounded. This is a propaganda thing, actually. This is an Arab cartoon that was picked up by Israel during the war and distributed by the Israeli embassies to depict how beleaguered and embattled Israel was, when the Israeli military knew it wasn't embattled by any means. Now, on the Arab side, as we know, we have very little, especially on the Egyptian side. We actually don't have scholarly studies, mostly because the archives haven't been opened till today. And this is what I want to talk about. What is it that we know? What it is that we don't know? What it is that we can know, given what is available? What it is that we should know, given what is available but concealed? So what we have, as I'm sure you know, is basically we don't really have a scholarly military study. We don't have a study of the military in Sinai till today. We have, these are American studies that are very important by American military observers, very much dependent on the Israeli side, again, because there's very little on the Arab side to depend on. So you see them referring to Israeli generals, and on the Egyptian side, they're nameless. We don't have names of Egyptian generals in these books. We have their units, but not the names. It's very thin, the scholarship here. On the Arab side, as I said, we have books like this, books about the psychology, the art, the impact of the war on cinema, the impact of the war on music. And of course, we have Haeckel, the master narrator, who has managed to really have a smoke screen in one book after another, culminating in his more than 1,000-page book, Al-Infigar, about 67, in which he deflects attention from military affairs. His scholarship, as well as his editorials in Al-Ahram, are really about international relations, are about things that happened in Washington, in Moscow, in Riyadh, in Cairo. And he says explicitly in the introduction of the book, I'm not really going to talk about the military. After the war, in a number of editorials, he tried to find out, actually relying on Israeli sources, relying on what Israelis have been saying to the international press about how they accomplished this. And he tried to explain to the public in Egypt what happened. Later, a few years later, we started in the 70s, we started having memoirs by the generals published in Arabic. Most importantly, Mortagi, who was the commander of the Sinai Front. He used to fight he was the commander of the Yemen Front for many years, for 4 years, and only a few weeks before 67, he was transferred to Sinai. When the war ended, Nasser wanted to find out what had happened, and he asked him to write a report, which he did, and he called it Taqrir Amana. And I think this Taqrir, it was never published, but I think it is this book that was later published in 1979. So this book is very much a censored version, redacted version of the report that he handed to Nasser. And if we have time, I'll tell you what I think has been redacted from this book. We have a very interesting account by Saladin Hadid II, who did not fight in Sinai. He was in command of Cairo in the war, defense of the central Mantaqa al-Markaziyya, central area, whatever, central province, whatever it's called, militarily, basically of Cairo. But this is one of the most incisive books, because there's something about the psychology there that is very incisive. And the book is also useful because Saladin Hadid II became later on the head of one of the military tribunals that tried some of the generals. So he had inside news, information, having presided over this trial. And then, of course, we have Fawzi, whose book was translated into English, an edited version of it. And it's an account of how he rebuilt the armed forces, but in order to say so, he had to say how it was destroyed. And that is the account of the war itself in this book. From these books, American, Israeli, and Egyptian, we have a fairly good account of the structural reasons for the defeat. We don't have a detailed account of what happened in Sinai on the ground. We don't have battle descriptions. from the Egyptian side, but we have a critical account of what happened. They are zooming out after the war, and they're basically saying that there are the following reasons, nearly for the defeat, that this is not an accident. This is they go to say, very close to saying that it was inevitable, that the defeat was inevitable. First, they say, Hadidi says, it's interesting that the Egyptians never had, in its history, the Egyptian military in its history, never had an offensive plan. It was never, not even executed or practiced. It was never put down. The Egyptians never had a plan to attack Israel. What they had is a defensive plan. It's called Qahir, that was put down in 1966. We see it here on the left. And it's a Soviet plan, Soviet design plan, based on the Soviet experience in the Second World War. The idea is to draw the Israelis in to this area, envelop them, and cut the supply lines and defeat the invading army. So the main defense line is here. These are advanced lines. This is the strategic reserve defending the passes, the mountain passes of Mitla and Jiddi, or taking, controlling the routes to the Suez Canal. The reason why the generals say that there was a structural defeat is that this plan that was never really practiced, it was put down on paper, the plan was never implemented. When the army was deployed, only on the 15th of May, 1967, so Sinai was effectively demilitarized from 1957 to 1967. The army stepped in only on the 15th of May. And between the 15th of May and the outbreak of the war, this plan, as old-fashioned as it might have been, and as ill-practiced as it might have been, suffered at least 4 major revisions that made it all but obsolete when the war actually started. And the generals say in their memoirs that some of the units had to change their position so many times that they actually traversed Sinai more than 1,000 kilometers before even one bullet was fired. So the troops were exhausted, confused, and some of them literally lost in the Sinai, even before the 5th of June. Then they point out to the fact that in April, all commanders of all the armed forces were changed for security reasons, unrelated to the impending war, because the crisis happened all suddenly. But because the military intelligence was always suspicious of Egyptian officers, so they had to reshuffle them. And there was a big reshuffling in 1966, not in April 1967. There also was a cut in budgets, most clearly visible in the airport defenses in Sinai, and that is why there was no air defenses to cover the planes. This is something that Air Force commanders have always complained of, that instead of having their airports defended, they actually had budget cuts. And lastly, a huge dependence on reservists. So this 100,000 men in Sinai were not fighting units. Many of them had been dragged from their villages with their galabiyas, with no training, with no weapons, with no actual units, and sent to the front in a very haphazard, arbitrary way. This is something that people had witnessed before the actual combat had started. And of course, Ahmed Said and his propaganda all covered up. But those generals who could see, they were very alarmed by the situation even before war started. So what about a vision? I mean, this is the strategic view. This is not a detailed view. And my interest is the actual combat experience. Sadly, we don't have many accounts to tell us what actually happened. What we have is fascinating accounts by some soldiers, most seriously by Muhammad Hussein Yunus. These are prisoners of war, so these are accounts of their experience in captivity. But just before being captured, they actually describe some horrific scenes. So the first few pages of this book have an account of his unit in the 3rd Division, 3rd Infantry Division, which I'll talk about in a minute. And we have a much more elaborate, much more literary account by Fuad Higazi, who died last year, about also his experience in captivity in Atlit, in a prison camp in Israel, close to Haifa, I think. So these give us an interesting account of the combat experience of soldiers. Then we have, despite all the attempt of censorship, we have fascinating accounts that go much deeper than this strategic vision that I just depicted. One of them comes from this book by Suleiman Mazhar. For a while, I didn't know who he was. It turns out he is the member on the left. I think it is this man. As you can see, this is a tribunal. This is a civilian rather than a military tribunal, even though he is in military uniform. And this is an exceptional case, exceptional court, Mahkam al-Thawra, they called it, that was established to try those officers who attempted to stage a coup against Nasser following the defeat, which is a huge story that I have spoken about before, that I'm just fascinated by. It's an integral part of the story, and it's completely forgotten by the majority of Egyptians. We just forgot about it. I'll come back to this later, but the interesting thing is that the book that this guy wrote, this book we see here on the left, is a book published in the 1990s, I think in 1990. It's a small book, it's a booklet. And it turns out it is, as you can see, the confessions of the June War commanders to the Committee of Documenting the Revolution, the 52 Revolution. It turns out that Sadat, when he came to power, he established a committee, mostly to defame Nasser, and he called it the Committee to Document the Revolution, 52. And one of the big things about 52 Revolution was to document 67. The interesting thing is that the head of that committee was Mubarak in his capacity as vice president. But be that as it may, the interesting thing is that Mazhar actually managed to use the minutes of the trial after the military censorship has approved it, and published 6 fascinating accounts that had never been published before, that take us 2-3 notches down below this strategic assessment that is nameless, and it's about structures and forces rather than individuals. And then, so this is a fascinating book. And then we have an interesting account by an Iraqi military specialist. It's published way earlier in 1973 but it's actually mostly dependent on Israeli sources. Actually, it is dependent on the book, The Tanks of Tammuz, that I mentioned earlier. It's not based, because in 73, none of this had been published. None of the Arabic sources have been published. And then we have this fascinating book by Sam Diraz, who's still alive. He's an amazing person who fought in 67, was tried and sent to prison in 1970, just before Nasser died, for yet another attempted coup. But what we have here is the closest we get to the story that is not told. It is the story of the officers who felt that they are betrayed, that the army was a victim of something. And this is when I started getting an inkling that something much more serious is happening here. That there is another story that has never been told. And that story is a story of serious divisions within the elite, the military, political elite, serious divisions within the army, these are middle-ranking officers rather than generals or soldiers. And there's about 10 or 15 accounts that tell us fascinating details that are indicative of how these structural causes I talked about in the beginning manifested themselves on the ground. I'll come back to this in a minute, but I just want to end this piece about the sources by saying that there is also an amazing source that we haven't been using, which is just newspapers. The different tribunals that were established after the war, most importantly, the tribunal, the trial of those commanders who tried to stage the coup. And as you can see it, the official title is the attempt to capture the headquarters of the armed forces. محاولة الاستيلاء على القيادة العامة للقوات المسلحة is the official title of this trial. It went on for months. There's a parallel trial about the intelligence services and the corruption in the intelligence services. Between these two trials, both of them civilian, not military, there is fascinating details. And this was, as you can see, front page. It went on for months, but we don't read. We don't read because it's difficult to find Al-Ahram. But I've been lucky to find these Ahram. Have been poring over them, as well as the weeklies, Al-Musawwar, Sabah al-Khir. Just to give you fascinating pictures of what Egyptians learned. Okay, so what is it that we learn, that we, from all of these, marginal stories that are not, they're not Hakel. Who's Assam Daraz? For me, much more important than Hakel. Mazhar's information is much more important than Hakel. What is it that, what is the picture that comes across? First, is that there is a structural fight between Nasser and Aimer. This is something I talked about earlier, and something that Egyptians found out about in 1968 from these trials. After Aimer's assassination/suicide, the Egyptian public discovered that these were two fatal enemies. This enmity reflected itself right there in the structure of the army. This is how, on the left, how Nasser would have liked to be in charge of the army. And this is what actually happened by Aimer inserting himself and having a separate line by which he could actually control the armed forces. What then resulted is that the units on the ground in Sinai had more than one line of command, one chain of command, which, needless to say, proved to be fatal. So this is one account. Pascal, are you still? You're still there. I mean, you can follow me. I mean, okay, because I'm not seeing anyone, so I don't know where people are. But it's, I mean, because I have my own screen in front of me. No, don't worry. Things are fine.
You can still have like thumbnails of the participants if you want. You just change your view from
Yes.
view options.
Yeah. That's fine. I did that. Thank you. So there is we now start seeing, by reading between the lines of these other books, between the lines of the newspaper accounts, we start understanding another picture that definitely Haeckel does not talk about. Haeckel would not like to admit that Nasser had chosen his best friend, and his best friend had basically turned the army against him. And when Nasser knew about this, he attempted to regain control of the army, and he never managed. The result is that the army is actually divided. What I attempted to do is, let me see, is to try and identify the actual commanders. This is the attack. We, as I said, we know the names of the people in blue, as you can see here. Sharon, Yofi, Tal. The names that I put, as you can see, this is my own handwriting. It took me actually more than a year to just find out this basic information. Who are the commanders of these divisions? There are 5 divisions, the 7th Infantry here, the 2nd Infantry there, the 6th Infantry there, the 3rd. This is a Palestinian Infantry, 20th Division here in Gaza Strip, and a strategic reserve of an armored division headed by El-Ghul here. Just to get these names, Abdel Menam al-Husseini, Abdel Aziz Seliman, Saadi Naguib, Abdel Qadir Hassan, Osman Nassar, and El-Ghul, took me many months. Once I put on Facebook, and maybe Pascal can remember this, a couple of months ago, I said, can you please, anyone, do you have pictures of these guys? People haven't even heard of them. I've been trying to tell the story, and I'm now piecing the story, not from the Israeli perspective, but from the perspective of these generals. So we, for example, know that Al-Husseini here in Gaza, on the 7th of June, surrendered. And he's seen here captured by the Israelis. But despite this, Khan Yunis, here you can see it, continued to fight after his surrender for one whole day, ferociously. The battles that took place here, by the Israelis against the 20th and the 7th Infantry Divisions, were ferocious, resistance, heroic. There's a story about Abdel Aziz Seliman, whose picture I could not find, that he resisted so ferociously that he died not once, but twice. I mean, of course, he died once, but the news of his death was received by Cairo, only to then his family discover that he had not died, but he had received, his headquarters had received a direct hit. His legs were amputated. He continued to fight, and then he died. So they received news of his death twice. So that's this is the major battle in Abu Agela here, and Saadi Naguib is completely incompetent. So this is A heroic defender here, someone who saw the writing on the wall and decided to spare the civilian population in Rafah, and he surrendered. Saladin Hadid is completely incompetent, and despite very, very strong fortifications in Abu Agila, he lost. This is a minor scene. This is where most of the invasion took place. And Al-Ghul is did not fire a single bullet. And there's a big trial about him, and he was eventually, there's a picture from his trial where he was discharged and deprived of his rank. The main person I'm concentrating on is this guy, Othman Nasser, who by the 7th of June, there is a possibility still to consolidate all retreating lines and hold this line here to be the main line of defense. And the question is, why did Osman Nasser not succeed in his position to hold this line of defense? And more specifically, why he did not obey orders to recapture El Arish up here in the north? Why he refused to execute an order to counterattack and take El Arish? And why, most seriously, he fled his troops and deserted. So this is a famous or infamous story of Osman Nasser leaving an entire division in the middle of that battle in the afternoon of the 7th of June and ending up in Ismailiyah, the headquarters, and later on in Cairo the following day. So this is a deserter, a general who deserted his men during battle. And it's not any division. This is the 3rd division. He still had 80 tanks. It's formidable. He is in a very strong fortified position. And he could still have, we could have, of course, my point is, we should have lost the war. The question is, why did we have to retreat all the way down here? Why was this line not consolidated? And one big reason is what happened to this particular guy, and that's him. This is a picture of him in his trial, interestingly, not for desertion, but for the attempted coup. He is the 3rd defendant in the attempt to overthrow Nasser in August of 1967. I read his account in Al-Ahram. He was cut short by the head of the tribunal, this guy, Hussein al-Shafi'i. But still, what I could manage to read from the printed account of his self-defense is that I did not desert, but, and this is where his account was cut short, but I could figure out what he was trying to say from various other circumstantial evidence. Basically, he was trying to say, I could not retake El Arish because the men I have under my command are not trained to fight at night. These are reservists, they are fallahin, but also my equipment is incapable of leading a nightly attack. And I had to fight at night because in the morning, the air cover we don't have, the Israelis would pick us up by their superior air command. Secondly, he is saying that the intelligence that I received from the military intelligence in Al-Arish about the strength of the enemy in Arish is faulty. I was told that he says it's only 6 tanks. The Israelis captured Al-Arish with 6 tanks. This cannot be true, but we all know why this is the case. This is the case because the role of military intelligence is to spy on us rather than spy on the enemy. So the military intelligence person, and he names him in Arish, is an incompetent, corrupt person. And then he says his trump card is that, in fact, it is the headquarters in Ismailia rather than I who deserted. So these are serious allegations and counter-allegations that tell us something about the result of this relationship, the result of this corrupt relationship between these two men who split the country between them and led us to a catastrophe that we're still paying the cost of till today. An enmity that caused the army and the country to be split in half. And the result is that the men who were sent to fight, the officers who were sent to fight in the generals are incompetent. There's no intelligence. They have no fighting spirit. And most seriously, as far as I'm concerned, if I'm interested in piecing together militarily what happened, there's no coordination between not only the forces, the Air Force and the naval forces and the land forces, but in the land campaign itself, there's no coordination between intelligence, signal corps, and the actual battalions fighting on the ground. So the question about the lack of air cover deciding the fate of the war, that is only partly true. That question is meant to end the story. And for me, this is the beginning of the analysis rather than the end of the analysis. Yes, the fate of the army might have been sealed, but there are different levels of defeat. And my question is not why we were defeated, the question was why we were defeated in this way. And an answer to this question does not lie in the character of Abdul Hakim Amir, who committed suicide, or actually earlier on who had a nervous breakdown, or because, as Nasser tried to say, the Israelis came from the west when we expected them from the east, or because the attack on the Air Force in the early hours of the 5th of June was so devastating that we lost the war in the first 20 minutes. This is only partly true. The true story is a much more complex story of a corrupt military and a corrupt political leadership. And it is this corruption that I'm trying to tell the story of, and it is a story of a corruption that we have never really been told. And despite all of these tribunals, this one and these, the details I'm telling you were never really told to the Egyptian public in a clear way. And indeed, what we see are only scapegoats that were given to the public to placate them, while the big questions were never really answered. I have much more to say, but I think I spoke way too much. So I will end here and receive questions, I think. I will...
do you want to just take the questions yourself? You can see them in the chat.
Yeah, but I will stop recording now.